A single drop of amber liquid hangs in the air, a suspended moment of pure arrogance. Below it, the crisp, dark fabric of a woman's blazer begins to stain. This isn't just a spilled drink on a transatlantic flight. It's an act of contempt. The flight attendant's smirk says it all. But she has no idea who she just insulted. She doesn't know that the woman in seat 3A holds the power to not just ruin her career, but to bring this entire multi-billion-dollar airline to its knees. In a few moments, a pristine FAA badge will emerge, and this Boeing 777 will not be taking off. It will be grounded indefinitely. The first-class cabin of Global Wings Air Flight 815 from New York's JFK to London Heathrow was a carefully curated bubble of tranquility. The soft hum of the auxiliary power unit, the muted clicks of closing overhead bins, and the gentle scent of warm towels and premium cabin freshener were all designed to soothe the frayed nerves of the world's elite. For most, it was an oasis. For Dr. Evelyn Reed, settling into seat 3A, it was a place of work, even when she was off the clock. Evelyn was not a celebrity or a CEO, though her tailored navy blue blazer, silk shell top, and the quiet confidence in her posture could easily have placed her in those circles. At 52, her hair was a stylish, short-cropped salt and pepper, and her eyes, sharp and analytical, missed nothing. Today, however, she was simply a passenger, a daughter flying to London to celebrate her father's 80th birthday. She was a world away from her actual job, where she was one of the most senior aviation safety inspectors for the Federal Aviation Administration, a ghost in the machine of the commercial airline industry, whose authority was absolute and rarely seen. She placed her leather briefcase, containing nothing more exciting than a new biography on Hedy Lamarr and a bag of her father's favorite American coffee, under the seat in front of her. As other passengers boarded, she observed the familiar dance of the cabin crew. A young man with bright eyes and a nervous energy offered pre-departure champagne. A seasoned purser named David greeted familiar frequent flyers by name. And then there was Brenda. Brenda appeared to be in her late 40s, with a severe blonde bob that looked as rigid as her smile. She moved through the cabin with an air of ownership, her pleasantries reserved for a select few. When she approached Evelyn's row, her smile faltered, becoming a tight, professional mask. "Can I take your jacket, Mum?" she asked, her tone clipped, a stark contrast to the warm welcome she had given the white businessman in 2B. "No, thank you. I'll keep it with me," Evelyn replied with a polite nod. Brenda's eyes flickered down to Evelyn's simple, elegant carry-on bag at her feet, then back up. She said nothing, but the look was a complete sentence. "You don't belong here." It was a look Evelyn had seen 1,000 times in 1,000 different places throughout her life and career. She had learned to catalogue it, analyze it, and dismiss it. Today was no different. As the boarding process concluded, the young flight attendant came around again. "Another glass of champagne, Mr. Henderson?" he asked the man across the aisle. "Ms. Reed?" he then offered, turning to her. Before Evelyn could answer, Brenda materialized at his side. "Let's focus on securing the cabin for departure, Daniel. The passengers have had enough." She gave Daniel a pointed look, then glanced at Evelyn's still full glass. The implication was clear. Evelyn had been served once, and that was sufficient. Daniel, flustered, scurried away. Evelyn took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, her gaze cool and steady. She wasn't looking for a confrontation. She was a safety inspector. Her entire career was built on de-escalation and objective analysis. But she was also a human being, and the subtle, persistent dismissiveness was beginning to grate. She noted the flight attendant's name from her badge, Brenda. She also noted the slight tremor in Daniel's hand as he collected glasses, a sign of a tense working environment. A compromised crew, even from simple workplace bullying, was a safety concern. The thought was automatic, a reflex from decades of training. The passenger who took the window seat next to her, 1A, was an elderly gentleman with a kind face and a tweed jacket. He introduced himself as Arthur Penhaligon, a retired history professor. They exchanged pleasantries, a brief and welcome moment of normalcy. The cabin doors were closed, the safety video began to play, and the plane pushed back from the gate. Evelyn leaned her head back, hoping the flight itself would be smoother than the boarding process. But as the aircraft began its slow taxi towards the runway, Brenda began her final sweep of the cabin, her heels clicking with an aggressive rhythm on the floor. It was then that the carefully constructed piece of the first-class cabin was shattered. Brenda moved down the aisle with a carafe of orange juice and a water pitcher, offering last-minute refills before takeoff. It was a standard service, but her demeanor was anything but. She smiled warmly at Arthur, topping up his water glass. "There you are, Mr. Penhaligon. Anything else for you before we're in the air?" "I'm quite all right. Thank you, my dear," he said, with a grandfatherly smile. Brenda then turned to Evelyn. The smile vanished. Her body language shifted, becoming closed and impatient. "And you?" she asked, her voice flat. "I'm fine, thank you," Evelyn said, turning her attention back to the window, wanting only to end the interaction. But Brenda didn't move. She stood there for a moment, an odd, tense silence hanging between them. Then, with the aircraft making a slow, gentle turn on the taxiway, Brenda's hand seemed to jerk. The carafe of orange juice tilted precariously. A stream of sticky, cold liquid cascaded directly onto Evelyn's lap, soaking the front of her navy blue blazer and the silk top beneath. The juice was shockingly cold against her skin. Evelyn let out an involuntary gasp. "Oh my goodness!" Brenda exclaimed, her voice dripping with a saccharine, insincere apology. "Clumsy me. The plane just lurched." But it hadn't. The turn had been smooth, almost imperceptible. Arthur, who had witnessed the entire event from inches away, stared at Brenda, his mouth slightly agape. He had seen it clearly. There was no lurch. Brenda's movement had been a deliberate, almost theatrical gesture. "I am so sorry," Brenda cooed, but her eyes held a glint of triumph. She made a great show of grabbing a few flimsy paper cocktail napkins from her apron pocket and dabbing uselessly at the massive stain. The napkins disintegrated almost on contact, leaving small white specks on the dark, wet fabric. Evelyn looked down at her ruined clothes, then up at Brenda's face. She saw no remorse, only a cold, calculated satisfaction. This was not an accident. This was a message, an act of petty humiliation meant to put her in her place. "That won't do," Evelyn said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Please bring me a cloth and some soda water." Brenda's feigned concern evaporated, replaced by annoyance. "Mum, we are on an active taxiway. I need you to remain seated with your seatbelt fastened. I'll get you something once we've reached cruising altitude." "You will get it for me now," Evelyn stated, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Your clumsiness has created this situation. You will rectify it." Arthur, the retired professor, felt compelled to speak up. "Excuse me, miss," he said to Brenda, his voice trembling slightly with indignation. "I must say, that looked less like an accident and more like... well, it was very unfortunate. The lady is soaked through. The least you could do is help her." Brenda shot Arthur a look that could curdle milk. "Sir, I will thank you to stay out of it. I am handling this." She turned back to Evelyn. "As I said, once we are in the air." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Evelyn sitting in a puddle of cold, sticky orange juice. The humiliation was sharp, but it was quickly being replaced by something else. A cold, focused anger. Not the hot, reckless anger that leads to shouting matches, but the precise, methodical anger of an investigator who has just witnessed a critical system failure. In this case, the system was crew professionalism, and the failure was catastrophic. Other passengers were now staring, whispering amongst themselves. The carefully maintained bubble of first-class serenity had burst. Evelyn unbuckled her seatbelt. Brenda, who had been watching from the galley, immediately marched back. "Ma'am, I told you to remain seated. That is a direct violation of FAA regulations. I can have you arrested when we land." Evelyn met her gaze. The threat was laughable, but Brenda's ignorance was profound. "The violation of regulations here is not mine," Evelyn said softly. "You have created a hostile environment and are refusing to mitigate a situation you caused. I need to speak with the purser or the captain. Immediately." Brenda crossed her arms, a smirk playing on her lips. "They're a little busy getting this plane off the ground. You're not speaking to anyone. Now sit down and buckle up, or this will get much more serious for you." Evelyn slowly sat back, but she did not buckle her seatbelt. She looked past Brenda, her eyes scanning the cabin, her mind racing. The plane was still moving, inching its way toward the runway. Time was running out. Brenda believed she held all the cards. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. The standoff in row 3 was a spectacle of silent warfare. Evelyn remained unbuckled, a quiet act of defiance that sent Brenda's temper simmering. The flight attendant saw a difficult, entitled passenger. Evelyn saw a dangerously unprofessional crew member who was escalating a situation instead of resolving it. A classic recipe for in-air disaster. "I am asking you one last time to fasten your seatbelt," Brenda said, her voice low and menacing, trying to keep the confrontation from boiling over into a full-blown cabin-wide incident. "Don't make me involve the captain in this nonsense." "I'm inviting you to," Evelyn replied coolly, her gaze unwavering. "In fact, I insist on it. Get him." This was not the reaction Brenda expected. Defiance, yes. Shouting, perhaps. But this calm, authoritative demand threw her off balance. She was used to passengers who could be cowed by the threat of authority. This woman acted as if she was the authority. Hiding her momentary confusion with a scoff, Brenda turned and marched toward the forward galley, grabbing the interphone. Passengers nearby strained to hear her side of the conversation. Her words were clipped and dripping with disdain. "Captain Miller, this is Brenda in the forward cabin. I have a situation with the passenger in 3A. Yes, the one I mentioned earlier. She's being disruptive. She's refusing to fasten her seatbelt for takeoff. It was a minor spill, completely accidental, and she's blowing it entirely out of proportion. She's demanding to speak with you. Yes, I agree. Completely out of line. Okay, I'll inform her." She hung up the phone, a smug, vindicated expression on her face. She walked back to Evelyn's seat, her posture radiating victory. "Captain Miller is busy with his pre-flight duties and ensuring the safety of this aircraft," she announced, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "He has neither the time nor the interest in mediating a dispute over spilled juice. He has instructed me to inform you that if you do not fasten your seatbelt immediately, he will return to the gate and have you removed from this flight by Port Authority police." The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Several passengers gasped. Arthur Penhaligon looked horrified. Removing a passenger was a serious step, a public shaming that would follow them. Evelyn, however, didn't flinch. She simply absorbed the information. The captain, relying solely on the word of a trusted senior crew member, had chosen his side. He had sided with Brenda without gathering a single fact for himself. He had failed the first, most basic test of leadership: situational awareness. In Evelyn's mind, this was no longer about a rude flight attendant. It was now about a compromised flight crew from the cabin straight to the cockpit. "I see," Evelyn said, her voice betraying no emotion. "So the captain's official position is to threaten a passenger who was assaulted by his staff and is now requesting to register a formal complaint?" Brenda's eyes widened in fury. "Assaulted? Are you insane? I spilled a drink on you. Don't you dare use that word. Your actions were deliberate, unprofessional, and you are now using your position, with the captain's backing, to intimidate me into silence," Evelyn stated, her words precise and cutting. "That constitutes a hostile environment, and in this environment, a metal tube flying at 500 miles per hour, hostility is a safety hazard." She was no longer speaking as a passenger. The FAA inspector had taken over. Each word was chosen to build a case. But to Brenda, it was just the nonsensical rambling of a woman who was about to be kicked off a plane. "You can tell your sob story to the police," Brenda sneered. She gestured to the seatbelt. "Last chance." For a moment, Evelyn considered her options. She could buckle the belt, endure the flight in her wet, sticky clothes, and file a mountain of paperwork upon landing in London that would make Brenda's life miserable. It was the path of least resistance. But something stopped her. It was the smugness on Brenda's face, the casual abuse of power, the captain's blind dismissal. It was the principle of the thing. The FAA didn't just regulate nuts and bolts, it regulated procedure and professionalism. Safety was a chain, and this chain was rotten from the first link. Allowing this plane to take off would be a dereliction of her own duty. Slowly, deliberately, Evelyn reached down, but not for her seatbelt. She picked up her leather briefcase and placed it on her lap. She opened the clasps with 2 sharp clicks that echoed in the tense cabin. Brenda watched, a confused frown on her face, expecting Evelyn to produce a phone to record her, an act she was prepared to shut down immediately. But Evelyn didn't pull out a phone. She reached inside and pulled out a small, unassuming black leather wallet. She flipped it open. Inside, nestled against a backdrop of dark leather, was not a credit card or a driver's license, but a gleaming, gold-embossed federal credential. Brenda squinted, not understanding what she was looking at. It was just a badge. Evelyn didn't say a word. She simply held it up for Brenda to see. The golden eagle seemed to catch the cabin light, and the words, printed in stark official font, became clear. Federal Aviation Administration, United States Department of Transportation, Aviation Safety Inspector. Below it was her photograph and her name, Dr. Evelyn Reed. Brenda's sneer froze on her face. The color drained from her cheeks, replaced by a ghastly, mottled white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The entire architecture of her reality, her authority, her power on this aircraft, her unassailable position, had just been demolished by a small piece of leather and gold. She was not looking at a difficult passenger anymore. She was looking at the very entity she was supposed to be afraid of. She was looking at the FAA. The silence that fell over row 3 was profound. It was as if the hum of the engines and the nervous whispers of the other passengers had been sucked into a vacuum. Brenda's face was a mask of disbelief, her brain struggling to process the information her eyes were relaying. The gold badge in Evelyn's hand seemed to burn with a cold fire, illuminating the cavernous depth of the mistake she had just made. What is that?" Brenda stammered, her voice a reedy whisper. It was a foolish question. The words were perfectly clear. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She let the reality of the situation sink in, watching as the flight attendant's bravado crumbled into dust. She snapped the wallet shut, the sound echoing like a judge's gavel. "You were saying something about the Port Authority Police?" Evelyn asked, her voice calm and level, yet carrying the weight of the entire federal government. Brenda flinched, as if struck. She took an involuntary step back, bumping into the drinks cart she had left in the aisle. A few plastic cups rattled. She looked around wildly at the other passengers who were now staring openly, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. She looked toward the cockpit, the source of the authority she had so confidently wielded just moments before. That door now seemed like the gateway to her doom. I don't understand, she managed, her professional veneer stripped away to reveal raw, panicked fear. You don't have to understand, Evelyn said, finally swinging her legs out of her seat and standing up in the aisle. But your captain will. She started walking toward the cockpit, her movements unhurried and deliberate. The stain on her blazer was a stark emblem of the incident, a piece of evidence she wore like a uniform. Brenda, momentarily paralyzed, was jolted back to action. "Mom, you can't! The cockpit is sterile!" she cried out, her voice cracking. The invocation of the sterile cockpit. Rule, the regulation prohibiting non-essential conversation during critical phases of flight like taxiing, was so ironic it was almost comical. She was trying to use an FAA rule to stop the FAA itself. Evelyn didn't even break her stride. She reached the cockpit door and knocked, a sharp, authoritative rap that was nothing like a polite request. It was a summons. Inside the cockpit, Captain Miller and his first officer, a young man named Tom Reynolds, were going through their final pre-takeoff checklist. "Who the hell is that?" Miller grumbled, annoyed at the interruption. He assumed it was Brenda again, with an update on the supposedly hysterical woman in 3A. "Tell them to wait," he said into the interphone. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. Brenda, standing helplessly behind Evelyn, was wringing her hands. "Please, Mom. Dr. Reed, please, let's just talk about this. It was a mistake. I was stressed. Pre-flight is always so hectic." Her pleading was pathetic. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had inverted with the force of a tectonic plate. The woman who had been a powerless victim a minute ago now held the fate of everyone on the plane in her hands. Evelyn ignored her completely. She knocked a third time, a sharp staccato that conveyed finality. Captain Miller, his patience gone, unbuckled his seatbelt. "I'll handle this," he muttered to his first officer. He opened the cockpit door, his face a thundercloud of irritation. "Look, I don't know what part of 'we are taxiing for takeoff' you people don't understand, but—" His words died in his throat as he took in the scene. He saw Brenda, pale and trembling, and a composed, stern-faced black woman standing before him, a dark stain marring her otherwise impeccable attire. But it was the object in her hand that made his blood run cold. She was holding open the black leather wallet again. He saw the eagle. He saw the words. His mind, trained to recognize threats and anomalies, instantly registered the significance of the credential. He had been through countless simulator sessions and training modules covering hijackings, security threats, and emergency procedures. But nothing had prepared him for this. This was not a threat to the plane. This was a threat to his command, his career, his entire airline. "Captain Miller," Evelyn said, her voice devoid of heat, but resonating with an unshakable authority that cut through the cockpit's hum. "My name is Dr. Evelyn Reed, Aviation Safety Inspector, badge number 74 Delta. You and I need to have a conversation. Right now. We will be holding our position on this taxiway. Shut down the interphone, kill the cabin music, and tell the tower you're having a slight delay. Then you, me, and your purser are going to have a chat. Am I clear?" Captain Miller, a 25-year veteran pilot who had commanded Sensei over war zones, felt a knot of pure dread tighten in his stomach. He looked from the badge to Evelyn's cold, appraising eyes, and then to the terrified face of his senior flight attendant. In that instant, he understood. He had not been given a request. He had been given a direct, lawful order. And there was only one correct response. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Crystal clear." The cockpit of the Boeing 737, once Captain Miller's unassailable kingdom, suddenly felt like a defendant's box. Evelyn Reed stood just inside the doorway, the purser, David, having been summoned and now standing awkwardly beside her, his face a mixture of confusion and anxiety. First Officer Tom Reynolds sat frozen in his seat, his hands hovering over the controls as if he were afraid to touch them. Captain Miller, his face ashen, had already radioed the tower. "Global Wings 815 holding position at taxiway Kilo. We're working a minor, internal crew issue. Stand by." Evelyn's eyes swept over the flight deck, taking in the myriad of glowing screens and switches. It was a familiar environment, a place she had spent thousands of hours in, both in reality and in simulators. Her presence was a silent, powerful indictment. "Captain," she began, her voice now clipped and professional, "please recount the report you received from flight attendant Brenda regarding the passenger in seat 3A. Miller swallowed hard. She reported a passenger was being disruptive after a minor beverage spill, that the passenger was refusing to fasten her seatbelt and was demanding to speak with me during a sterile cockpit phase. And based on this second-hand report, your response was to threaten to have this passenger removed by law enforcement," Evelyn asked. "My primary concern is an on-time departure and the safety of the flight. A non-compliant passenger on the taxiway is a safety concern," Miller said, attempting to frame his actions within the bounds of protocol. "A non-compliant passenger is indeed a concern," Evelyn conceded. "But a crew member who deliberately provokes a passenger, lies to her colleagues, and misinforms the flight deck is a far greater one. Did you at any point attempt to verify your flight attendant's report or speak to the passenger directly?" "I trusted my senior crew member's judgment," Miller mumbled, knowing how weak it sounded. "Your trust was misplaced, Captain." Evelyn turned her head slightly to address the purser. "David, were you aware of this situation?" David, the purser, looked terrified to be caught in the middle. I heard Brenda complaining about a passenger in first class earlier, during boarding. Just that she seemed entitled. I wasn't aware of the details until a moment ago." Evelyn's gaze hardened. So, the prejudice had been established even before the flight pushed back. This was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a bias. She turned her attention back to Miller. "Captain, let's be clear about what has happened. Your senior flight attendant has, through either gross negligence or deliberate action, assaulted a passenger. She then lied about the incident and attempted to use your authority to intimidate the victim into silence. You, in turn, accepted her false report without question and chose escalation over investigation. From my perspective, this entire crew's professional judgment is compromised." Miller's face flushed with a mixture of shame and anger. "With all due respect, Inspector, it was a glass of orange juice. Brenda has been flying for 20 years. She made a mistake. It's a customer service issue, not a federal case." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you think this is about? Customer service?" "Let me reframe this for you in terms you'll understand, Captain. A flight attendant's primary role is not to serve drinks. It is to ensure cabin safety. It is to be a calm, authoritative presence during an emergency. It is to evacuate 300-plus souls from a burning fuselage in 90 seconds or less. Your flight attendant," she continued, her voice dropping to an icy calm, has demonstrated that she is reactive, dishonest, and vindictive. She is compromised by personal prejudice. What do you think she would do in a genuine crisis? If the passenger she needed to help save was someone she had already decided she didn't like, would she perform her duties impartially? Would she follow procedure? Based on her conduct today, I have zero confidence that she would. Her presence on this aircraft is a direct and unacceptable safety risk. Every word was a hammer blow, dismantling Miller's defense. He had no answer. She was right. Furthermore, Evelyn went on, her sharp eyes scanning the cockpit again. While seated, I noted several minor maintenance write-ups that should have been addressed at the gate. The latch on the overhead bin at 3C is loose, and the fraying on the seatbelt in my own seat, 3A, is beyond acceptable wear and tear limits. Small things, perhaps, but small things, when coupled with a breakdown in crew discipline, point to a larger culture of complacency. She took a deep breath. The moment had arrived. Captain Miller, based on the demonstrated failure of crew resource management, the hostile and unprofessional conduct of your cabin crew, and outstanding maintenance concerns, I am no longer confident that this flight can proceed safely. Pursuant to my authority as a credentialed aviation safety inspector under Title 49, Section 40-113 of the United States Code, I am formally grounding this aircraft. The words hung in the air, heavier than the 400-ton aircraft they were sitting in. Grounded. It was the ultimate power word in the aviation industry. "You will return this aircraft to the gate immediately," Evelyn commanded. "You will inform the tower that you are returning at the direction of the FAA. You will make an announcement to the passengers about a delay, but you will not disembark them until you are met at the gate by the airline station manager and an FAA ground supervisor, whom I have already notified. Is there any part of that order, Captain, that you do not understand?" First Officer Reynolds looked like he had seen a ghost. Captain Miller, defeated, slumped in his chair. The fight was gone, replaced by the cold, heavy realization of a career-defining catastrophe. He had let his ego and blind trust in a subordinate lead him to this point. He keyed the microphone to speak to the control tower, his hand trembling slightly. "LaGuardia Tower, this is Global Wings 815. We are aborting our taxi. I repeat, we are aborting. We are returning to the gate at the direction of the FAA." In the cabin, a collective gasp went through the passengers as they felt the massive jet slow and begin a wide, ponderous turn, heading back the way it came. Brenda, who had been listening from the galley, leaned against a counter, her legs giving way beneath her. It was over. Her career, her life as she knew it, was over. And it had all been undone by a glass of orange juice, and a woman she had decided was not worthy of her respect. The journey back to the gate was the longest taxi of Captain Miller's career. The silence in the cockpit was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the radio as the air traffic controller, his voice laced with confusion, cleared a path for them. On the ground, the news that an FAA inspector had grounded a 777 on an active taxiway was spreading like wildfire. This wasn't a mechanical issue or a weather delay. This was an intervention, a rare and dramatic exercise of federal power. Evelyn stood her ground, a silent sentinel of authority. She had made her decision and issued her orders. "Now," she observed. She watched Captain Miller's posture, the stiff, defeated set of his shoulders. She watched the first officer, Tom Reynolds, who kept shooting nervous glances her way, his face a billboard of anxiety. She knew this incident would be dissected for years to come, in training rooms and boardrooms. Her only goal was to ensure the right lessons were learned. In the cabin, chaos was a quiet, simmering thing. The passengers who had been expecting the roar of takeoff were instead whispering furiously. The plane's slow reversal was unnatural, unsettling. Everyone knew something was profoundly wrong. "What's happening?" Arthur Penhaligon asked the nearest flight attendant, the young man Daniel. "Are we going back?" Daniel, his face pale, could only stammer, I'm not sure, sir. The captain will make an announcement shortly." But the announcement didn't come. Captain Miller was in no state to speak to his passengers. His mind was racing, replaying every moment, every decision. Why hadn't he just gone back to the cabin? Why had he taken Brenda's word as gospel? The questions were a torment. Brenda had sequestered herself in the forward galley, out of sight. The other flight attendants gave the area a wide berth, as if it were contaminated. Her career was over. They all knew it. No flight attendant could survive a direct confrontation with an FAA inspector, especially one that resulted in a grounding. She was now a pariah, a cautionary tale that would be told for a generation. Through the small porthole in the galley door, she could see the terminal getting closer and closer. It wasn't a welcome sight. It was the end of the line. As the 777 was marshaled back into gate C-34, a small crowd was already waiting on the tarmac. Evelyn could see them from the cockpit windows. A man in a sharp suit, his face a mask of grim concern. Undoubtedly Robert Vance, the JFK station manager for Global Wings Air. Beside him were two other individuals in official vests, one of whom she recognized as Mark Jacobson, the local FAA field office supervisor she had texted earlier. The system was now in motion. The jet bridge hadn't even finished docking when Captain Miller's phone rang with a satellite call from corporate headquarters in Chicago. He ignored it. He had a more immediate authority to answer to. The moment the engine spooled down and the fasten seatbelt sign was extinguished, Evelyn turned to Miller. "No one deplanes until I say so. I will meet the ground personnel first. You, your first officer, and your entire cabin crew will remain on this aircraft. You will be interviewed individually. Secure the cockpit." She walked out into the cabin. The atmosphere was electric with tension. All eyes were on her. She was no longer just the woman in 3A who had been doused in orange juice. She was the cause of this unprecedented event. She walked down the aisle, her stained blazer a silent testament, and stood at the main cabin door, waiting. The jet bridge operator gave a thumbs up, and the heavy door hissed open. Robert Vance, the station manager, was the first one through, his face a carefully controlled mask of professional concern, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. "Dr. Reed, I'm Robert Vance, Director of Operations for JFK. "Mr. Vance," Evelyn acknowledged with a curt nod. "Your aircraft is grounded. Your flight and cabin crew are to be detained for interviews. The FAA will be conducting a full safety and procedural audit of this aircraft and your crew, effective immediately." Vance's composure cracked. A full audit. That was a nightmare scenario. It meant his entire operation would be under a microscope. It could mean fines, suspensions, a black mark on his own career. "Of course, Inspector. Whatever you need," he said, his voice strained. "Can you tell me what the issue is?" "The issue, Mr. Vance," Evelyn said, her voice carrying just enough for the passengers in the first few rows to hear, "is a complete breakdown of crew resource management and professional conduct, originating with your senior flight attendant and enabled by your captain. It created an unsafe condition for flight. That is all you need to know for now." She then turned to the FAA supervisor, Mark Jacobson. "Mark, secure the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. I want toxicology tests for the entire crew, standard procedure. and I want a full statement from every single one of them, starting with flight attendant Brenda." The passengers who overheard this exchange were stunned. Toxicology tests? Hostile conduct? Unsafe condition? This was far more than a simple delay. Brenda, who had been forced to emerge from the galley, heard every word. At the mention of her name, she swayed on her feet. This was a full-scale federal investigation, and she was at the center of it. Evelyn then addressed the bewildered passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Evelyn Reed. I am with the Federal Aviation Administration. This flight has been grounded due to a safety concern. Global Wings Air will be making arrangements for your travel, but this aircraft will not be flying tonight. Please remain seated for a few more moments." She turned to Robert Vance, her expression unyielding. "Mr. Vance, your first priority is your passengers. Get them rebooked. Get them hotel vouchers. Get them food. Handle your business. My business is with your crew." With that, she stepped onto the jet bridge, followed by the FAA officials. She had set the wheels of justice in motion. The chaos she left behind in the cabin, the angry, inconvenienced passengers, the terrified crew, the panicked airline executives, was merely the fallout. Her job was done. The system would take it from here. The hours that followed the grounding of Flight 815 were a blur of systematic, dispassionate investigation. While Robert Vance and a swarm of frantic Global Wings agents dealt with a cabin full of furious passengers, a mix of confused tourists, irate business travelers, and a few who were vocally supportive of Evelyn after witnessing Brenda's behavior. Evelyn herself had established a command post in the airline's operations center. The crew of Flight 815 was escorted off the plane, not through the public terminal, but down a set of stairs to the tarmac, where they were met by airport security and FAA personnel. They were not under arrest, but they were not free to go. They were sequestered in separate conference rooms, their phones confiscated to prevent them from coordinating their stories. The atmosphere was clinical, cold, and terrifying. Brenda was the first to be interviewed. She sat opposite Evelyn and Mark Jacobson at a long, polished table. The swagger and arrogance were gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading demeanor. She tried to cry. She tried to apologize. She tried to frame the incident as a misunderstanding, a moment of stress on a bad day. "I've been flying for 22 years, she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I have a perfect record. I would never, ever jeopardize safety. The juice, it was an accident. The plane turned, and I lost my footing." Evelyn listened patiently, her face unreadable. When Brenda was finished with her rambling, self-serving account, Evelyn slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "Then perhaps you can explain this." It was a printout of passenger witness statements. The first one was from Arthur Penhaligon, Seat 1A. His account was meticulous, the work of a historian used to documenting facts. He described Brenda's dismissive attitude during boarding, her condescending tone, and the juice incident itself. "There was no lurch," he had written. "The aircraft's movement was smooth. The flight attendant's action appeared to me to be a deliberate, jerking motion. Her apology was immediate, but seemed theatrical and insincere." The next statement was from the passenger in 2B, the businessman Brenda had been so friendly with. Even he noted that Brenda's attitude toward the passenger in 3A was noticeably cooler than her interactions with others. A third statement, from a woman in row 4, corroborated the story, adding that Brenda's threat to have Evelyn arrested seemed wildly disproportionate and unprofessional. Brenda stared at the papers, her face slack with shock. She had counted on the power of her uniform, on the assumption that her word would always outweigh that of a passenger. She had never imagined the other passengers were watching so closely, or that their testimony would be taken so seriously. They're mistaken," she stammered. "Are they?" Evelyn asked softly. "Is the purser, David, also mistaken? He stated that you referred to me as entitled before I had even settled into my seat. What was that based on, Brenda? Was it my luggage, my tone, or was it something else?" Brenda had no answer. The carefully constructed narrative of an accidental spill and a difficult passenger was unraveling thread by thread. Next came Captain Miller. He was a man humbled, stripped of his command. He sat rigidly in his chair, his pilot's uniform suddenly feeling like a costume. He answered Evelyn's questions truthfully, his voice heavy with regret. He admitted he had not verified Brenda's story. He admitted he had relied on his trust in a long-time colleague. "I made an error in judgment, Inspector," he said, looking Evelyn directly in the eye. "I failed to de-escalate. I failed to investigate. I allowed a member of my crew to dictate a safety situation from the cabin. There's no excuse." Evelyn respected his honesty, but it didn't change the facts. "Your error could have had catastrophic consequences, Captain. A divided, hostile crew is a danger to every soul on board. You know that." "Yes, ma'am, I do." The investigation broadened. The maintenance logs were pulled. As Evelyn suspected, the frayed seatbelt and broken latch had been noted by a previous crew 2 days earlier, but had been designated as low priority, to be fixed within 7 days. While not a grounding offense on their own, they painted a picture of a station cutting corners, of a culture that prioritized on-time departures over meticulous attention to detail. It was the exact kind of systemic complacency the FAA was created to prevent. As the night wore on, the full scope of the fallout became clear. Robert Vance, the station manager, was now facing questions from corporate headquarters. Why was a flight attendant with a history of minor passenger complaints, which a deeper dive into her file was now revealing, still on the prestigious transatlantic route? Why were maintenance write-ups being deferred? The grounding of Flight 815 was no longer just about Brenda. It was about the entire JFK operation for Global Wings Air. By dawn, the preliminary findings were damning. The cockpit voice recorder confirmed Miller's account and Brenda's biased report. Interviews with the other flight attendants revealed a pattern of Brenda being a workplace bully, especially toward younger crew members like Daniel. Brenda's career was over. Captain Miller's was irrevocably tarnished, and Global Wings Air was about to face the full, unblinking scrutiny of a federal investigation, all because one flight attendant decided a black woman in first class didn't belong there and picked the wrong woman to make an example of. The immediate consequences for the crew of Flight 815 were swift and severe. Before the sun set on the following day, Global Wings Air, under immense pressure from the FAA and scrambling to contain a public relations nightmare, took decisive action. Brenda was terminated, her 22-year career ending with a sterile, one-paragraph email from Human Resources citing gross misconduct and violation of company policies and federal aviation regulations. She was informed that the airline would not be providing her with legal counsel for any potential civil or federal actions that might follow. She was, in an instant, completely alone. Her union filed a grievance, a procedural move, but the leadership privately told her the evidence was so overwhelming that she should expect nothing. The story of her takedown by an incognito FAA inspector became an instant legend, a hushed tale told in galleys and crew lounges across the world. Captain Miller was suspended indefinitely, pending a full review by both the airline and the FAA. While his contrition during the investigation was noted, his failure of command was too great to overlook. He was ordered to undergo intensive crew resource management retraining, a humiliating demotion for a senior captain. It was likely he would never command an international flight again, destined to finish his career flying domestic routes, a constant reminder of his lapse in judgment. First Officer Tom Reynolds received a formal letter of reprimand for his passivity, a black mark on his record that would follow him for years. But Evelyn Reed's actions had set in motion something far larger than the discipline of a single flight crew. The grounding of Flight 815 was the first domino in a long, cascading line. The FAA, with Evelyn's initial report as its foundation, launched a full-scale audit of Global Wings Air's entire East Coast operation. Teams of inspectors descended on hubs at JFK, Boston, and Miami. They pored over maintenance logs, training records, and employee complaint files. What they found was a systemic problem. They discovered a culture that tacitly encouraged pushing boundaries to maintain on-time performance statistics, a key metric for executive bonuses. They found dozens of complaints similar to Evelyn's, allegations of biased treatment from passengers of color that had been dismissed by station managers as subjective customer service issues. Robert Vance, the JFK station manager, was fired 2 weeks into the audit. The investigation revealed he had personally buried at least 3 formal complaints against Brenda, noting in one internal memo that she was a legacy employee who just has an old-school way of doing things. The financial repercussions for Global Wings Air were staggering. The initial FAA fine for the litany of violations uncovered was $1.7 million. The cost of the flight cancellation, passenger compensation, and the subsequent operational disruptions ran into the millions more. Their stock price dipped 8% in the week following the incident, as the story, initially leaked on an aviation blog, was picked up by major news outlets. The headline was irresistible: FAA Inspector Grounds, Flight After Being Assaulted by Crew. The airline's CEO, a polished executive named Richard Hayes, was forced to issue a public apology. He announced a complete overhaul of the company's customer service and crew training programs. A new, mandatory, bias and de-escalation training module was developed, with the case of Flight 815 as its central cautionary tale. Evelyn Reed was not named, but everyone in the industry knew who the anonymous senior FAA inspector in the training video was. Evelyn, for her part, retreated from the spotlight. She filed her final report, a document praised by her superiors as a model of clarity and professionalism, and returned to her duties. She hadn't sought revenge. She had enforced standards. She had seen a crack in the formidable wall of aviation safety and had done her job to repair it, not just for herself, but for every passenger who would ever fly on that airline again. She had wanted to get to her father's birthday in London, and while she arrived a day late on a different airline, she brought with her the satisfaction of a job well done. The system had been tested, and it had worked. Justice in this case wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about reinforcing the very foundations of safety and respect that are supposed to govern the skies. Months after the grounding of Flight 815, the ripple effects continued to spread, not just through Global Wings Air, but across the entire aviation industry. The incident became a catalyst, a stark and public wake-up call that forced airlines to confront uncomfortable truths about implicit bias and crew culture. Other major carriers, fearing a similar incident and the brutal FAA audits that would follow, proactively launched reviews of their own training protocols. The story of Brenda and Captain Miller became a powerful teaching tool in flight academies and recurrent training programs. Pilots were reminded that their authority came with the absolute responsibility of diligence, and that trusting your crew did not mean trusting them blindly. cabin crew members were retrained on the core principles of their job, that safety and impartiality were paramount, far outweighing any personal prejudice or desire to win a conflict with a passenger. Dr. Evelyn Reed, though she never sought public recognition, became a figure of immense respect within the FAA. Her colleagues lauded her for her restraint and professionalism under pressure. She had endured a humiliating personal attack and had channeled her response not into personal vengeance, but into a systemic correction that would benefit millions of travelers. Her superiors offered her a promotion, a desk job in Washington, D.C., leading national policy. She politely declined. She felt her true place was in the field, where the real work of ensuring safety was done. She was an inspector, and that was where she could make the most difference. One crisp autumn afternoon, about 6 months after the incident, Evelyn found herself at Chicago O'Hare, preparing to board a flight to Seattle for a routine inspection. As she walked down the jet bridge, she noticed the flight attendants greeting passengers at the door. One of them, a young woman, saw Evelyn approaching, and her eyes widened slightly in recognition. She had clearly seen the internal training memos. As Evelyn handed her boarding pass, the flight attendant met her eyes and gave a small, respectful nod. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Reed," she said, her voice genuine. "It is an honor to have you on our flight today." The purser, who overheard, came over immediately. "Inspector Reed, welcome. Please let us know if there is anything at all you need to make your flight comfortable and safe." There was no fawning or excessive attention, just a quiet, profound respect. The word had spread, the standards had been reinforced, the message was clear. Professionalism and impartiality were not optional. As Evelyn settled into her seat, she looked out the window at the ballet of ground crew and baggage handlers on the tarmac. The system was vast, complex, and built on the assumption that thousands of people would do their jobs correctly every single day. Most of the time they did. But when they failed, for reasons as petty as prejudice or as dangerous as arrogance, the system needed a failsafe. That day at JFK, she had been that failsafe. The plane took off smoothly, climbing into the vast, blue expanse. Evelyn leaned her head back, not as a passenger, but as a guardian. The skies felt a little safer today, not just because a rogue flight attendant had been removed, but because an entire industry had been reminded that the rules of safety, conduct, and basic human decency apply to everyone at every altitude. And sometimes it takes just one person, standing firm in their duty, to ensure that they always will. What began with a condescending look and a deliberately spilled drink ended in a reckoning that reshaped an entire airline. This wasn't just a story of karma. It was a powerful reminder that true authority isn't about a uniform or a title, but about integrity and the courage to uphold standards, no matter the personal cost. Dr. Evelyn Reed didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Her professionalism and the weight of her duty spoke volumes, grounding a plane to ensure that the principles of safety and respect were not left on the tarmac. This story shows that one person's actions can have a ripple effect, forcing positive change even in the most powerful industries. Prejudice and arrogance are burdens that can ground more than just airplanes. They can ground careers and reputations. If you are moved by this story of justice in the skies, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. What did you think of Evelyn's actions? Let us know in the comments below.